Russia against any individual European country, including our own, by the way, would be an uneven match. But if we're united, then it's an uneven match in our favour, not in Russia's. So we have to stay together.
Well, the Prime Minister has spoken to President Trump on the eve of talks in Saudi Arabia between delegations from the US and Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer said he hoped there'd be a positive outcome that would enable the US to resume providing military support and sharing intelligence with Ukraine. The Prime Minister will host another round of talks at the weekend with more than 20 countries who may be prepared to send peacekeeping troops to join a coalition of the willing if a deal is agreed. But does Britain have the military capability to play a leading role in such a force? ITV's political editor Robert Peston is reporting tonight that the Strategic Defence Review has concluded that it would take a decade to make our armed forces a credible deterrent because they've been hollowed out over the past 25 years. Well, let's talk to Professor Sir Malcom Chalmers, who's Deputy Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. Good evening, Malcolm.
Good evening, Carol.
What do you make of this report that the Strategic Defence Review has actually been completed and that it's saying we're going to have to invest a huge amount to get our armed forces up to scratch?
Well, I think I haven't seen it, so I can't comment definitively. But the fact that the government has committed to quite a significant increase in the defence budget to 2.5% of GDP within the next couple of years, but more significantly to 3% of GDP by the middle of next decade, indicates their belief that more resources are needed. So I think that that's entirely consistent in that regard. And if GDP continues to grow at the rate it has been recently, then we are looking at something like a 50% real increase in defence spending over a decade, which is really quite substantial. And if well spent, it can address many of the problems which your reporter suggests that the SDR is highlighting, and quite rightly, in my view.
Yeah, but of course, we know how slow defence procurement can be. We've been hearing for months about the scale of the problems in our armed forces. This report tonight says, such as the shortage of personnel, ammunition and hardware, the deployment to Ukraine would make it almost impossible for the UK military to engage in any other theatre of conflict at the same time. So there are risks to the UK of putting its military eggs into the Ukraine basket. I mean, this is, of course, at a time when Keir Starmer is trying to get this coalition of the willing together and has made it clear that he's prepared to put peacekeeping troops on the ground if there's a deal. I mean, do you accept that view that this would mean our forces being pretty severely overstretched?
Well, I think one of the things, one of the conclusions I would draw is it would be very foolish for the UK, if there were to be a deal in the near future, to be allocating a very large proportion of the available forces to such a coalition. I think the main purpose of the proposal and this discussion of some sort of assurance force for Ukraine is to try and keep the Ukraine and the United States on the same page as they enter negotiations with Russia. I think that Russia has a say in all this, and Russia has been fighting this war for the last 3 years to ensure Ukraine is subjugated and isn't part of the Western bloc, the NATO bloc, if you like. So I would imagine that Russia will very strongly oppose any suggestion that it signs a deal which would allow large number of NATO troops onto Ukraine's territory.
Yeah, exactly. And Russia has been saying that already, hasn't it? It has said that it would not be acceptable for troops to be on the ground from NATO countries, even if they weren't necessarily there operating under a NATO flag. I mean, doesn't that just underline quite how risky this operation, still a potential operation, could be?
Well, all the discussion of this potential operation so far has been premised on the assumption that there is an agreed ceasefire a permanent ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, to which both Ukraine and Russia have agreed. And I think, as you say, we're quite a long way from that. I think that the real game here is persuading the Americans to sign up to a proposal for a peace, which is also acceptable to Ukraine and Europe. And the Americans, I think, the Trump administration has been annoyed from their perspective. Ukraine isn't prepared to sign anything. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are saying, yes, we are prepared to accept the temporary loss of some territory, but only if we have assurance that the Russians won't start the war all over again at a time they're choosing. And that requires Western troops on their territory. The Americans have not yet rejected that. The Russians have rejected that, but the Americans have not yet rejected that. The real negotiation has not begun, because the real negotiation is one that obviously has to involve Russia. The fear in our government, in Ukraine and across Europe, is, if you listen to President Trump's rhetoric, there's a concern that he will give Russia everything it wants, which is basically Ukraine's surrender, Ukraine becoming essentially a satellite state of Russia. And that's something Ukraine will never accept.
Lots of our listeners are getting in touch on this. Adrian says, does the Starmer cabinet understand the difference between peace implementation and peace support in Ukraine? It's not acceptable just to say we'll do peacekeeping. Stephen's questioning what the physical threat to the UK is, please. But I guess the reason why we would be doing this is an acknowledgement of the threat that Russia places not just in the immediate future to Ukraine, but more broadly beyond that.
I think that's right. The UK's security in Europe since World War II has been derived from our ability to have a permanent alliance with all our neighbours and with the United States. And the worry if Russia were to subjugate Ukraine and then threaten other NATO countries, that Russia would seek to pick off countries individually. And in that scenario, Russia against any individual European country, including our own, by the way, would be an uneven match. But if we're united, then it's an uneven match in our favour, not in Russia's. So we have to stay together. And that's why collective defence, meeting our promises to countries like Poland and the Baltic republics and Sweden and so on, is so important. It does involve taking some risks, but if NATO were to break up, the risks would be much greater.
But can those countries that are talking about a coalition of the willing, and of course we're at the early stage of those discussions, possibly be an effective deterrent without the US backing, which seems in doubt at best?
Well, I think Keir Starmer has said so far, at least, that this proposal would be dependent on the Americans providing a backstop and providing an assurance that if that force got into trouble, the Americans would be there. So that's absolutely key. I mean, the direct answer to your question, it would be very difficult. But of course, if you're looking at the balance of forces on the ground after a ceasefire, the main force deterring Russia from restarting the war would be the Ukrainian forces themselves, which have shown themselves very capable. What Western forces would be providing is an addition to that, not a replacement for that. And in that regard, they can provide a very useful addition. I think the government's been actually quite careful not to use the term peacekeeping so much. The idea is not to have British and French and other forces on the front line between Ukrainian and Russian forces responding to every small breach of a ceasefire. I think that the main focus has been on providing forces in key places like airports and ports, government buildings and so on, to try and ensure them.
Professor Sir Malcom Chalmers, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
No, so.
We've had lots of you getting in touch on this. James says far too little defence spending, decades of underinvestment means we need to double at least defence spending. Nuclear takes too much and is reliant upon the US, and we need our own tactical nukes plus missile defence shields, James says. And Keith is questioning, what does it say about our own country when we need help and permission from another country to use our own weapons, especially when they have an unfriendly president? Well, do keep your thoughts coming in to us